Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back to many of the witnesses. Welcome for the first time to some. Today's hearing presents an opportunity to discuss the role of the nation's largest banks. At the outset, let me acknowledge what should be obvious. Banks are essential for supporting the economy and advancing American competitiveness. Their core functions of taking deposits, making loans, processing payments, in several cases, underwriting and making markets and securities, these all help to safeguard savings, provide credit, and enable economic growth. With nearly $13 trillion in combined assets and operations ranging from mortgage banking to small business lending, the banks here today make vital contributions to the nation's prosperity. But where I see a system at the heart of free enterprise, I worry that other policymakers see opportunity for social engineering. There are activist regulators and some of my colleagues who see banks as a tool by which they can advance their social policy. Unfortunately, there's a growing trend among some banks, several of whom are represented here today, of inserting themselves into highly charged social and political issues really unrelated to their businesses. Banks' willingness to help liberal policymakers achieve their goals makes it very difficult to mount a principled defense against such politicization. Some of my colleagues are pressuring banks to use both their balance sheets and their influence to address issues wholly unrelated to banking, such as global warming, gun control, voting rights, even abortion. Several large banks have been too willing to acquiesce to these demands by embracing an ESG agenda that is harmful to America. Nearly every bank at this hearing has pledged to meet a net zero greenhouse gas emission goal by 2050, with several making even more specific commitments. But absent some major technological breakthrough, carrying through on such pledges will eventually lead these banks to artificially restrict, reduce, or even cut off funding for traditional energy projects. Despite statements to the contrary, none of this really has much to do with borrowers' credit quality or so-called transition risk. It's because activists have made the traditional energy sector politically disfavored. We're witnessing the folly of such policy right now in Europe, which strangled its own fossil energy sector and now finds itself deeply reliant on Russia for gas. Does anyone really believe that as the U.S. experiences 40-year high inflation, we should exacerbate the problem by reducing oil and natural gas production and increasing energy prices? But that's exactly what will happen if banks follow through with their net zero pledges and ESG agenda, as environmental activist groups have urged them to do. And when you combine that with the SEC's proposed climate disclosure rule, these net zero pledges are setting up banks for lawsuits and legal liability. Apparently, some banks may be starting to acknowledge this reality. A report in the FT just this week says some banks are considering leaving the so-called Net Zero Banking Alliance, a UN-sponsored group that intends to name and shame banks that don't meet net zero pledges. In my view, it was a mistake to join this group in the first place, but for the sake of shareholders in the U.S. economy, banks distancing themselves now would be a welcome step. In addition, banks have inserted themselves into contentious social issues and in some cases even made business decisions based on these factors. For example, several banks responded to pressure from Democrats in the wake of the Supreme Court Dobbs decision by very publicly pledging to pay for the costs of their employees to travel to have abortions. Now, this decision is certainly an individual bank's choice, but it does raise a number of questions, including, have these same banks also committed to pay the cost for female employees facing unplanned pregnancies to place their children up for adoption? Notably, when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, which is an actual constitutional right, some banks have gone out of their way to make it harder for law-abiding Americans to exercise this right, from stopping the financing of manufacturers of so-called military-style firearms for civilian use, to debanking retailers that sell firearms to customers under 21 years of age, even when such sales are perfectly lawful. I can't help but observe that when banks do choose to weigh in on these highly charged social and political issues, they always seem to come down on the liberal side of the political spectrum. Beyond the examples I've already given, there are others. Banks that have opined on abortion but not on religious liberty. Banks that have expressed support for voting access but are silent on voting security. Banks that have expressed support for DACA, but I haven't heard much about border security. So in my view, it's bad business to alienate roughly half the country, but you're private companies, you're free to opine as you see fit. But it's no wonder that there's been a backlash from policymakers in states like Texas and West Virginia and Florida. If banks don't cease and desist from weighing in on social and cultural issues, Don't be shocked if Republicans, once back in power nationally, seek to pressure banks to advance their goals. Now, I would oppose such efforts, just as I oppose similar efforts by liberals. But once the precedent is set, the potential for future abuse is limitless. Throughout this Congress, I've repeatedly warned about the politicization of our financial regulators and our central bank. I've emphasized that addressing political issues requires difficult decisions involving trade-offs, and in a democratic society, those trade-offs must be made by elected representatives who are accountable to the American people. Today, I'm raising similar concerns about the politicization of our nation's banks. Just as regulators and central bankers are not elected by the American people, neither are bank CEOs. So banks are currently at a critical crossroad. Accept the role that some liberals prefer, which is to have your institutions implement social policy on behalf of the state, or embrace your history as drivers and promoters of free enterprise and stay out of highly charged social and political issues. I strongly suggest you choose the latter path, and I suggest that if you don't, you do risk being treated as public utilities by both parties in the future.